My name is Albert Nsengiyumva. I'm the Executive Secretary of the Association for the Development of Education in Africa. The association is hosted by the African Development Bank in Abidjan, Ivory Coast. It is a great privilege for me to chair this first plenary session, and I would like to acknowledge the presence of the Minister of Education from Rwanda, Dr. Valentine Uwamariya. Thank you, Minister, for hosting the second eLearning Africa on the continent. So Rwanda has hosted the same event in 2018, so this is the second time. Let me also welcome everyone here. It's a pleasure to see faces that I've been seeing in the eLearning Africa. My first time to attend eLearning Africa was in 2010 in Lusaka, Zambia. How many of you were in Lusaka? See, so I always say eLearning Africa has become a family, and it's really great to see that we are seeing faces coming up whenever the event takes place. So, welcome you all today. It is an incredible achievement to have brought so many people together here in the aftermath of the pandemic. And it is wonderful that the eLearning Africa family has come together again. We have nearly 1,000 participants that have registered, and I'm sure more will be joining. And I'm sure by tomorrow morning we'll be able to reach the full number and understand there are some delays with COVID testing outside. So hopefully in another hour or so, all participants will be here. Participants come from over 70 countries, mainly from Africa, which is also a great achievement. Of course, I can mention a few countries that are really on top. As always, of course, the host country, Rwanda. I'm glad to hear that there's a great number from participants from Rwanda. We have Kenya. Who are from Kenya here? Can you just... so Kenya is really leading in terms of number of participants, followed by Uganda. Can we see Ugandan participant? Thank you. Welcome, Ugandan. Nigeria is also here. As we all say, one African out of 5 come from Nigeria. So I hope we are meeting the number, you know. So that's good. And of course, South Africa. Do we have South Africans in the room? Yeah. Welcome, South Africa, in this place. Of course, I can continue the number. I was also impressed by the number of USA citizens. Can you show? There's a great number from people from US that are in the room. Thank you. Welcome to all. We would like to thank all of the sponsors and partners, some of our leading companies and organizations in the world. They're here. Without their support, this conference would not have been possible. I'd also like to thank the government of Rwanda, and in particular, the Ministry of Education. Minister, your team has been wonderful. I would like, in the name of the eLearning Africa, the support team from the ministry has been very, very critical to make this event happen. So let me really acknowledge their efforts and dedication. Let me also thank the Minister of Communication and Innovation. Hopefully the minister will join at some point the event to share what the country is doing in terms of promoting innovation, especially looking at the great opportunities that are given to young people to innovate around technology. And of course, last but not least, the Rwanda Convention Bureau that has been supporting this, the preparation from the beginning. I would like to acknowledge them as well. I encourage you to visit the sessions. They are going to be, of course, plenary, but also parallel sessions the next 2 days, as well as the exhibition in the Concourse in the foyer. So, and I'm sure you have seen them. They are great solutions that are being proposed, so they are great opportunities, and so Please take your time and visit. The exhibition is full of many interesting companies and organizations. So thank you again for joining this event. Without taking too much of our time, so I'd like to invite the first speaker, Mark West. He works for the UNESCO education sector, where he examines how technologies can improve the quality, equity, and accessibility of learning, especially in the developing countries. So Mark, the floor is yours. Yeah, please come.
Thank you very much, Albert. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a real pleasure to be here to address you today. You have a very diverse panel here, academic training. We have a philosopher, we have a futurist, and we have an education minister who was trained as a chemist. My formal academic training was in history. And historians believe that to look forward, we need to look to the past. We need to reflect on the past and understand what has happened before. To move forward wisely, we must take time to look back, to pause. And that's what I want to do today. I'd like all of you to sit here today and to think, how will you remember the educational experiences of the pandemic? Those weeks and months, and in some cases years, in which children were fully reliant on technology for learning. I also wish to consider how we collectively will remember. We should care about these questions more than most. EdTech is our field. And let us be clear-eyed. What occurred over the past 2 years was the largest and longest EdTech deployment ever attempted in countries and globally. It is common to hear people refer to it as a world-spanning experiment. But it was no experiment. It was a lived reality for learners, for teachers, for policymakers, and all of us sitting here. Now is also the right time for reflection. The memory is molten, not yet cast. We are still considering, debating, negotiating what experiences and lessons to retain, and gradually this information, these remembrances, will converge around certain narratives. Storylines will form, settle, and harden. So I ask you, what happened? What was the narrative arc of what occurred? What are the memories and lessons you will draw? What lessons should we draw? We cannot shy away from these questions of history, of story. They will steer what we do tomorrow, next month, next year in education, particularly as it relates to technology. In a few weeks, UNESCO will release a major publication to assist this memory-making process. And it cuts through the hype about EdTech. It drops the language of potential and observes and describes in plain language with facts and evidence what the global shift from school-based learning to technology-reliant distance learning entailed for real people in real places over the past 2 years. And our publication proposes that this experience is best understood and best remembered, not as forced progress or uneven salvation, as many have proposed, but rather as a tragedy. Its title is An EdTech Tragedy. Why tragedy? Tragedy provides a lens to more clearly see and more fully comprehend the numerous adverse consequences the hard shift to technology entailed. These include, and just a few, the normalization of learning in isolation and at a distance, the homogenization of the learning process, deepened reliance on private and for-profit service providers to assure the right to education, an uncritical acceptance that the digital transformation of education is desirable, inevitable, and a pillar of education resilience. Tragedy also provides a forceful rebuttal to a growing consensus that the education sector somehow advanced, leapfrogged, catapulted, or disrupted itself to a better future when it deployed technology on a massive scale as a temporary measure, and is now being fast positioned as a long-term solution even as the pandemic abates. The evidence overwhelmingly points in the opposite direction. Education became less accessible, less effective, less engaging when it pivoted away from schools and towards technology exclusively. Additionally, the censorship, data extraction, advertising, top-down control, intimidation, surveillance that so often characterize our current models of digital change, these have functioned to corrupt rather than service our highest aspirations for education. These outcomes, I want to argue, are justifiably understood as tragedies. It's hard to see them in any other light. The work that UNESCO will release, it spans several hundred pages. It cites evidence from around the world, and it incorporates the voices of those who experienced learning with technology directly. It's impossible to summarize this publication in such a short address. So what I wish to do with my remaining time is to examine the promises of technology and contrast them against the reality of what was actually delivered in 2020, 2021, and early 2022. In doing so, I think you will agree, or at least you will open your mind to this idea that the unprecedented and full reliance on connected technology has set education on a dangerous trajectory. It is a trajectory at odds with education's status as a human right, as a public endeavor, and as an endeavor that is vital to social and community cohesion, well-being, knowledge development, and citizenship. In coming face to face with these outcomes, we can better imagine new approaches and new models for technology integration in education. We can also see with greater sobriety what technology cannot do, its many limits, and the ways it can constrain our sense of what is possible. An overly intensive focus on technology, despite its ever-growing power and versatility, can straitjacket our imagination and lead us to do things that defy common sense. So let's take a moment and look at the promises and what education actually delivered. EdTech has long promised to make education more accessible and more inclusive. And when schools closed, this is what people turned to. This was the way we were going to ensure the continuation of formal learning. But what happened? Most learners, a global majority of learners, experienced no EdTech at all. It did not reach the millions and millions of people who had previously been serviced with education in schools. This was, if I may, exclusion by design. We all knew how many people this would leave behind, yet we turned to this as an exclusive solution regardless. There were many reasons for this, but costs and a lack of digital skills were first among them. Let's talk about some of those costs. Hardware. Smartphone affordability as a factor of income varies enormously across countries. It ranges at the low end from between 4 to 5% of the average monthly income in Botswana, Jamaica, and Mexico, to, at the high end, 222% in Burundi, and over 600% the average monthly income in Sierra Leone. Yet this is what we told people to use to stay connected to education. Totally out of reach for huge numbers of people. Connectivity. 1 gigabyte of mobile data costs about 27 US cents in Italy. In Madagascar, what does it cost? Over $5. In Yemen, over $15. And in Malawi, over $25. Let's talk about digital skills. Our sister agency, ITU, put out a report in 2022 that estimated in low and middle income countries, nearly a quarter, 25% of adults, are not even aware that you can access the internet on a mobile device. Yet we told these families to turn to that mobile device to access education. Exclusion from EdTech, it's severe globally, but it is especially severe for women and girls. According to reliable data sources, women in sub-Saharan Africa are approximately 40% less likely to use the mobile internet than men. These gender gaps widen at every stage of the mobile internet journey, from awareness to ownership to adoption, and finally to regular and productive use of that technology. Let's look at the second promise that EdTech said it would deliver: equity. It was supposed to give everybody a fair shot at learning. It was hailed as a tool that could bring quality education to the furthest corners of our countries. And it could untether schooling from the exclusionary and often high costs of educational institutions. There was a hope that digital futures would be more equitable than education that had revolved exclusively around in-person schools. That was the hope. That was the promise. What happened? Inequity was supercharged. We didn't even make an attempt to reach the learners who had not already been in school with our solutions. Our solutions were aimed only at the students who were already being served in educational institutions. Physical schools, by contrast, they had helped guarantee that modes and models of education provision were reasonably similar for students from different backgrounds and different income groups. Yet, when it shifted over to technology, children from upper and middle class families were, by many measures, 2 to 3 times as likely to access online learning than children from working class families. Also, we must remember, virtual learning was not placeless learning. The corporal bodies of students did not go away. And for many students, the physical home environment was a place that made technology-dependent modes of distance learning difficult and in some instances impossible. We have to remember, folks, schools are sanctuaries for many students. There are young people who their home lives are hell, and school is a place where they can escape that temporarily. With digital learning, there is no escape. They were trapped at home. Those were the models that we had used. Also, speaking about students with disabilities, accommodations for students with disabilities, almost unilaterally, this is in developing and developed countries alike, completely ignored when education shifted over to digital technologies. These were students and learners that had been being served in school when it was an in-person, physical, and lived experience. Let's look at another promise. EdTech was meant to strengthen engagement, achievement, and outcomes. This is what many people had touted about that digital technology would make learning more exciting and it would ensure better results. And let me also say that when a lot of work went remote, employers noticed that people were working longer hours. A sort of engagement with digital learning didn't seem impossible. Some people early on thought that people might spend more time on education than they had in schools. But what does the evidence show? People spent dramatically less time learning. We did analysis on this at UNESCO. In many countries, students were spending on average less than 30 minutes a day on learning and educational tasks. Teachers in international surveys ranked the effectiveness of distance learning only slightly better than skipping school completely. The longer the reliance on EdTech, the greater the rate of drop-off, fallout, disengagement from formal education. And huge numbers did drop out, and there is little chance that they will return to education. It is the first time, folks, since big pushes around universal education, that progress towards achieving universal education has dramatically declined. I only have a little bit of time, so I'm going to skip this. These are for the book. It's meant to be a teaser. But let me get to a concept that's very close to my heart, and that is this one. If there's one thing that people will tell you EdTech is needed for now, it's not necessarily to improve achievement. It's not even needed to make education more interesting, more engaging. It's needed because education systems have to be resilient. Because, folks, we live in a dangerous world, and there is another crisis right around the corner in which schools might have to close. That's the pitch. We should plan so that schools never close. We went back and looked at what happened at the last global pandemic. Happened almost exactly 100 years ago. 1918, 1919, influenza pandemic. Guess what was the great educational lesson that had been learned? Guess how long the school closures were? Very short. Why? Schools were understood to be centers of health. What was the primary lesson that was derived from that experience? It was to put a healthcare provider and a nurse inside every school. It was to improve ventilation in schools. It was to decrease class sizes. What has our response been? Our response is, we can close schools, and now, today, around the world, we're seeing all sorts of reasons that schools are closing, totally unrelated to the pandemic. It's because the streets are not safe. It's because there's a mild weather event. It's because we can't find enough teachers. We need to protect what we have built over centuries, over decades. Do not underestimate how much energy, how much labor has gone into building our system of schools and teachers and places where young people can come together into a community of peers and learn to live together. We should protect this, and we should be very wary of the promises that are being sold to us about EdTech. I stop here. I know that was not what people were expecting from an eLearning Africa address. I want to give credit to the organizers for having the courage to allow us to share some of these reflections. And we look forward to working with all of you to find new directions for this digital transformation of education. Directions that do not bypass and go around schools, but directions that include them. We've put forward some of these ideas in the Global Declaration on Connectivity for Learning. And we look forward to drawing on your intelligence, on your experiences, to ensure that we change course and build a digital learning experience that is inclusive, accessible, and high quality for all. Thank you very much.
My quick comment is Mark could probably be a good priest or a pastor. I don't know how many, would actually be able. So thank you, Mark, for your remarks. I was reading in a local coffee shop, they were putting somewhere, everything is questionable. So I think that's what really Mark is trying to say, to tell us today. But the most important thing, I think, is really a debate. You know, I think what I like from eLearning Africa is really bringing people from different backgrounds is always good, so that they can really question some of the practices, some of the policies. And this does not really reduce the importance of technology. I think we just need to question how we do things in a way that is critical. I think that's really the point that Mark and probably many of you will be making during the coming 2 days. Before inviting the second speaker, let me acknowledge a few ministers that I see here. And I'm sorry I did not do it before. I can see faces that I know. So we have Deputy Minister from South Africa here. Deputy Minister, welcome to, if you can just come up and then people see you. She's the Deputy Minister for Basic Education from South Africa. I see the Minister from Malawi. Welcome, Minister. I see the Deputy Minister from Sierra Leone. Welcome, Minister. So, as you can see, women are dominating. So, that's really great. And I see Deputy Minister from Zimbabwe, Moyo, welcome. Of course, the Minister of State from Rwanda, Minister Gaspar, welcome. Is there any other minister that I may have missed? I don't want to miss any. Are you a minister? Who? So, any minister that I have met? Oh, wow, Ghana. Yeah, please come up. Please come up. I'm sure we can get. She said, yeah. So, the Deputy Minister from Ghana. Welcome. Welcome to. Yeah. So, the second speaker is known as Njeri. She is a senior futurist. She researched the future. She comes from the Institute for Future Research at Stellenbosch University at the Stellenbosch Business School in South Africa. Her main focus is around leadership, transformation, equity and inclusion. And I'm sure she will actually be alluding to some of the issues that Mark came up with during her speech. And I'd like just to point out one critical issue that I want you to address, Jerry. The 3 priorities around resilience and adaptability of the education system. So if you can touch a bit on that, it would be very great. So welcome, Jerry.
Good morning. Allow me to stand on all protocols observed and to express my absolute pleasure and honor to join you here at this eLearning Africa Conference 2022. After some difficult years with the COVID pandemic, wonderful to be connected and together again. And let me also express my absolute honor and privilege to join such an esteemed group of panelists. Let me expand on some of the descriptions given by the previous speaker. We're joined not only by academics, but leaders, thinkers, shapers of Africa's education futures. My few remarks are intended to open the discourse and engagement space amongst ourselves here towards imagining multiple possibilities that could be realized in Africa's education futures. Building on what the first speaker mentioned on history, it's also important for us to build on the journeys already walked and the lessons learned, and from here to envision new potential, broader opportunities, and to recognize that there are still obstacles to surpass and multiple constraints to address. So in taking my cue from our chair, Albert, I would like to share on some critical factors that are impacting education futures. I'll reiterate a lot of what the previous speaker mentioned, but I hope to add a bit more context. So first, I'll be speaking to the issue of access. I'll also mention the issues of content. And finally, I will also speak to the issues of application. Importantly, in discussing these critical factors impacting education futures, I want us to reflect on some questions. Let us open the space for questioning and critical thinking. Where is education accessed? Mark has already begun to pinpoint some of the challenges in how we frame this question and how we respond to this question. Then, which content is privileged? As we sit here in Kigali, Rwanda, drawn from multiple different cultural contexts, ourselves working in multidisciplinary, multi-sector areas, which content do we focus on and privilege? And finally, what systems and support mechanisms exist for application when we think about our education futures? So before I move into my remarks, let me give some context. First, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals offer us a wonderful framework from which to work from. I will be focusing, of course, on UN SDG 4, but recognizing that all the goals are interrelated in one system of interdependency, and therefore in addressing education for all, inclusive and equitable quality education, and promoting lifelong opportunities. This is within the context of the full 17 goals of the UN SDG. Next, I also want to highlight the context of change that we are operating in now. This is a key context for my few remarks on access, content, and application. We've just come through the COVID-19 pandemic, but from a futures perspective, we are moving into an era of change, rapid change, exponential change. And not only that, but change that is very much defined also by crisis. And we use the acronym VUCA a lot, which means that our world is increasingly shaped by volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Ambiguity meaning we are not sure where we're going or how we're going to get there. Then finally, I am a futurist, so I will be speaking from the context of strategic foresight or futures thinking, which aims to provide tools that help us make sense of this VUCA world so that we can better anticipate what can happen, precisely towards taking meaningful, impactful action. So I'm at the Institute for Futures Research. We're based at Stellenbosch University under the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences in the Business School. The work we do is focused on growing qualified professional futurists who can deal with rapid change and complexity and create a desirable future. I share this because we are the only academic institution that offers programs in future studies on the continent of Africa. Future studies is a field that has been introduced formally to education from around the 1970s, but increasingly we are arguing and advocating for future studies to be included as a core part of curricula. We need to think long-term, deal with complexity, and create the futures that we want, which means exercising our agency. Then let me give you a few principles of futures thinking. One, to dispel misconceptions, and also to curb any untoward expectations. If I may quote from the founder director, Prof. Philip Spies, we were established in 1974. He says that the ultimate purpose of future studies is not to predict the future. Its ultimate purpose is to create a desired future through better foresight development and better long-term decision-making. So in asking the questions here today, I am not providing the answers. I'm inviting us to engage collectively in thinking around how we can shape the futures that we wish for. Another key principle from future studies is the idea that there are different kinds of futures that are possible. It is not a unidirectional, linear trajectory from today to a given, predetermined, predefined future. No, there are also many different probable paths to the futures we want to create. So we can allow ourselves to think broadly, creatively, imaginatively about what can be possible. And in doing this, we encourage broad thinking, deep thinking, thinking that questions and reframes. So, on that basis, let's get into a few comments on those three critical factors I highlighted. Firstly, on access. I think the previous speaker has already shared a lot of what we need to consider around this particular critical factor. But issues that are highlighted in terms of education futures we wish to build, building on the UN SDG 4 and the broader UN SDG framework, is access especially to those cohorts of our populations that have been ignored, at the periphery, and need to be intentionally included. I mentioned here issues of gender, and allow me to expand the definition of gender to include all the discussions, the complex discussions around gender that we are beginning to have internationally and that are also beginning to be had on the continent of Africa, but also issues of disability. Then facilities, as Mark mentioned, facilities are key, especially when we think around futures of education. What are the sites of learning and where will these be? How will we ensure the infrastructures, whether digital or physical, are in place? And are we putting measures into action now that will create futures in the next 2, 3, 4 generations? Are the facilities we're building looking to longer-term futures? And yes, there's online learning, but what does online learning mean for future generations in a world of digital inequity, where we see a digital divide? A key question I want to leave us with here as we move into other aspects of this conference are: which sites of education are centered? Which ones do we believe should be centered, and why? Let's move on to content. Remember, I'm not providing answers, I'm simply stimulating some thinking. We know that when it comes to content, a key issue when thinking around futures of education, of course, is relevance and quality. And coming from South Africa, being within the higher education system there, our student body is really pushing this conversation, talking around transformation of the curriculum, ensuring that learning speaks to the challenges of the youth today, and that this learning is relevant and quality. Quality defined by the social impact and the innovative solutions that are proffered, that are provided in terms of the challenges we face. Then, of course, the issue of STEM and sciences, technology, engineering, maths. This is not something I believe can be avoided, given that we can see in the world around us the fourth digital revolution, the innovation around technology is broadly expanding across the world. How do we ensure, however, that our STEM education is experiential, i.e. connected to the experiences of our everyday lives, and therefore speaking to questions of sustainability, of impact, and of course, as we mentioned, inclusivity and equity. But let's not forget the arts. So often, especially in audiences where we're very focused on tech and digital and science, the arts are increasingly important. We need to think around how the arts and creative thinking build connection, intergenerational connection, intercultural connection, connection across different languages, where linguistics may fall apart. What other forms of communication offered by the arts can we mobilize? And therefore, how can we use the arts and creativity to build relationship to our communities, to our stakeholder groups, and broadly across the different environmental and geographies that we occupy? And finally, the issue of empathy, so that we know when we're delivering content, when we are developing content that's relevant, that's quality, that looks at the STEM subjects, that includes arts, that we also have empathy for the different perspectives that are represented by the multiple talents that humanity has to give us. So can we create empathy in terms of the content that we are developing and the education futures that we're hoping to build? Because only in understanding the positionalities that we each occupy and the interdependencies, that's how we will find solutions that speak to the systemic issues. And finally, let me move on to application. Of course, we are in the midst of a digital transformation. And this digital transformation is shaping new worlds of work. At the business school, we're confronted with this on a daily basis. New worlds of learning, e-learning, digital learning, but also learning, as I mentioned, that is located in different areas, from the rural to the urban to space, if we look into the futures. So we are also looking at application of education for new worlds. And of course, when we think around the digital transformation and application and the rampant spread, especially of social media that has created hyperconnectivity amongst us, we need to think around issues of reach and impact, because application only in isolated, privileged, elite spaces is not an application that speaks to building new worlds or education futures that are inclusive, equitable, and accessible to everyone. So colleagues, let's think around how in building new platforms for application, we are seeking to mend and build bridges rather than to deepen and create divides. So how would I suggest we move forward from here? What can our conversations cover in these next few days as we consult amongst ourselves, build partnerships, work towards collaboration? I suggest we need new futures frames. And in as much as we need to look at our history, we need to look at our futures with new lenses. Let us expand our imagination. Let us also deepen and broaden our analysis of the challenges and the issues we face. And finally, I suggest we apply different lenses, and lenses that we can learn from each other, building on that relationship, connectivity, empathy, and connection. So let's move forward, and as we talk about a new purpose for education, question what we need to learn and unlearn, what we need to reimagine, as well as imagine afresh. And finally, what are the conducive policy and support mechanisms for this, speaking to issues of leadership, decision-making, and action. Let us welcome diverse approaches, alternative approaches, and expand our futures, because there are multiple possible futures that are available to us, and they start today with the agency and action that we put into place. So colleagues, as we open formally this e-learning conference 2022, I welcome you to walk together into a future that we can create. Thank you so much.
Thank you for welcoming us to the future. I think it's a very interesting, thank you, Jerry, for your presentation. Really setting stage of the coming 2 days discussion that we need to have on top of technology. How do we create the future we want? I think that's the point I'm making. And thank you for clarifying that you are not predicting the future. You are really supporting to create the future. I think it's a very important point that you make. Thank you. Again, I understand there's a minister that I forgot. So there's a minister of Niger here. Le ministre du Niger est ici. Vous pouvez, je m'excuse de... Merci d'être là, monsieur le ministre. Our next speaker is known as Professor Mogobe Ramos. He is a philosopher and one of the key thinkers to have popularized the African philosophy, specifically the concept known as Ubuntu, the Ubuntu philosophy. He is a professor of philosophy focused primarily on ethics, African philosophy, and philosophy of law. I had an earlier discussion with him because one of the things that we were looking at, particularly in these opening sessions, and to see the role of education to support the new African free trade area. Of course, when we talk about trades, we look at transactions, we look at all these things, but on top, there are also values that we need to share as a continent. How do we value what we are producing as an African. So I think that's also very important to take into consideration. So Professor Ramos, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Sanibonani nonke. Good morning to you all. That's what I did say. And please allow me to convey my infinite gratitude to the organizers of this conference for me to participate. I don't quite see well what I would like to read. I don't know technology. Can there be some light here, please? This invitation brought me for the first time to Rwanda, one home of one of the giants of contemporary African philosophy, namely Alexis Kagame. Okay. His magnum opus, Philosophie Bantu Rwandaise des Lettres, is still an important source in the elaboration of African philosophy of being or ontology. I am also most thankful to you all for having chosen to participate in this conference by setting aside some of your commitments. My topic is as follows: a few grams of shaded gray and a coarse sand-like substance seem insufficient to demand ethics. I propose to discuss this topic by focusing on one thesis. I will speak to this thesis very briefly, meaning there will be omissions, there will also be gaps in my reasoning. The thesis itself is divided into 7 interconnected parts. Underlying the thesis is the argument that sensitivity to good and evil ought to translate into ethical reasoning and practice. So the thesis is as follows: the conquests of Africa in the unjust wars waged by the Arabs and the West have turned the indigenous peoples of the continent into a mother of sorrows, a real mater dolorosa. Yet, Africa is the precious mother, the mater preciosa, scintillating her ravishing beauty of being the irrevocable cradle of humankind. I now proceed to identify the 7 sorrows. You will put the numbers. I will not say number 1, although they are numbered here. Number 1, the injustice of conquest in an unjust war, having penetrating and enduring effects ramified in the lives of the indigenous peoples of the continent. This is what we see today. This original unjustified violence divided the world into the colonized and the colonizer. It was the first establishment of social distance with deadlier consequences than the social distance imposed by COVID-19. The social distance of COVID-19 is an appeal to ethical proximity to the other. Epistemic and social injustice is the second sorrow. Education for servitude ought to change into education for liberation. Can e-learning, under the grip of capitalism, deliver education for liberation? Number 3, I depart from my promise. Number 3, economic injustice, manifesting in the deification of wealth and money, adored by the structural systemic poverty and hunger. This is the third sorrow. After all, the bottom billion is not an historical accident. Decolonization in the form of political independence only intensified the practice of epistemological dependency and economic bondage to the erstwhile colonial conqueror. Money as an ethical problem in Western philosophy is traceable to its antiquity and is still alive in our time. It is unethical for wealth or money to trump, as it is continuing to do, the human right of all human beings to the pluriversal collective ownership of Mother Earth. The injustice of current dominant economic system lies precisely in its denial that Mother Earth is the bread basket, the ontological panarium of all human beings, including all that lives. Money is inserted as the decisive medium between life and death of all human beings. Having money is the seeming guarantor of the fulfillment of the right to life, the inalienable right to subsistence. Having no money is the inevitable condemnation to abrupt or slow death, including violent death. Sorrow number 4 is religicide and the superstition of economic bondage based upon the logic of baptism. Unborn future generations are subjected to compulsory baptism in the name of capitalism because of the original debt incurred by their forebears. By this obligatory baptism, a socio-economic system that is unjust at its root assures its continued existence. I pause to make the point that my reference to religicide actually also emanates from the historical experience of conquest. However, I should like to make the point that an African Christian Roman Catholic clergyman called Saint Augustine actually made the point that any religion that is worth its salt should actually be ready to make a transition from the complacency of staying into the frying pan and be put into the fire of critical reasoning. So, no religion is above criticism. We know that a lot of religions, especially coming from the West, have got in their package of theology what they call dogmatic theology. And of course, dogma is a barrier and a blockage to the quest for truth. Number 5, technological authoritarianism, incorporating human beings into the community of useful robots. Now, this is sorrow number 5. I elaborate a little bit. It is important to remember that the information and communication technology was originally confined to the military domain. When it was extended to the civilian sphere, the 2 pillars of military logic, namely command and obedience, continue to play the same role as they do in the military domain. One of the effects of this is the replacement of cum communicare. Cum, from its Latin root, means with. Cum is with. Communicare, speaking with. So this speaking with is replaced with command from. It is ubere, it is command. What we have then is the locutio, or the speech, of the commander demanding obedience from the users of technology. Time is vital in this process because waiting for longer than the prescribed time results in the cessation of the activity or can result in the death of the soldier, metaphorically speaking. Impatience and intolerance with the user emerge as some of the basic elements of this technology. A technology without a human face. It allows us to see the faces of others except its own face. Yet, there is a face behind this technology, the face of inhumane accumulation of wealth and profit making. The time of this technology is ethically blind. It is against the ethical dimension to time, demanding humane courtesy to the other by communicating the expiry of the time allocated with patience and tolerance. Accordingly, the proper name of information and communication technology is actually commandocution. So I made some kind of ellipsis. What we have is commandocution. it is technological authoritarianism. Here, human beings are not only end users, happy with a user-friendly technology. We now are under the command of robotics, turning us into useful members of the community of robots. For those of us who were in conqueror South Africa under a different political heat, we are not surprised. Commandocution is not new at all. We used to hear, Muni denkni, doen wat ek sê. Translate that, don't think. Do what I say. You better command. So you see, commandocution is not new to us. It is a problem from an ethical point of view. Against this background, I'd like to remind us that it was Kwasi Wiredu, also one of the giants in the time of Alexis Kagame, one of the giants in African philosophy, who made the point that it would profit us in Africa very little if we were to discard the humanist principles and absorb wholesale and uncritically what technology can offer. Well, we go to sorrow number 6. Law that is foreign in its own land ought to remedy this travesty of justice. African law on its own terrain is actually foreign. This is incompatible. That is why Nkrumah refers to it as a tragedy of justice. The practical dominance and supremacy of the law of the colonial conqueror in the new states of Africa is a gross violation of natural justice. In fact, when this point was recalled in the UN conference which was held in Durban, well, it was just not to be discussed. It did not have to come to the table. In 1994, when conqueror South Africa ascended to a new political dispensation, next door in Kampala, there was a conference held in April 1994. The theme of the conference is more revealing. It was a conference on reparations to Africa. The very theme that law in its own country may not be foreign applies also to the languages of Africa. Again, at this point, we remember and recognize Alexis Kagame's monumental work on the consanguinity of African languages. It is work complemented by Isaac's argument that the Proto-Afro-Asiatic language may well have been the original language of humankind. Okay, I wrap up. We stand in gratitude of the African Union today for having recognized Kiswahili as one of its official languages. Sorrow number 7 and the last one, I will skip. The incorporation of copyright law into the Organization for the Harmonization of Business Law in Africa, en français OHADA, is epistemic subservience, destroying communal knowledge as one of the basic elements of African ethics. And this is the message of the philosophy of Ubuntu. The 7 sorrows of Mother Africa is actually the message of the philosophy of Ubuntu. I will skip the conclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Mogobe. Indeed, education for servitude ought to change to education for liberation. Thank you for conveying the message. Let me now introduce the host, the Minister of Education from Rwanda, Dr. Valentine Uwamariya. Let me again thank you for making your time in several other issues that you are sorting out on a daily basis. Having spent time with us is really great. A quick introduction. Before Minister joined her current position, she went through, I think I was impressed to see your CV. I did not realize you have been at the University of Rwanda. You did chemistry, then to University of Wits in South Africa, again chemistry, science, and then to University of Delft in the Netherlands. She studied water science and environmental technology. When she came back home, she had worked for the University of Rwanda as a professor, dean of science in the faculty, in the College of Science and Technology. She was also, before she joined the ministry, deputy vice chancellor of the Rwanda Polytechnic, responsible for training, institutional development, and research. So very impressive CV. So I'm happy that we have you here. You understand the challenge better than anyone that you are facing. I had an opportunity to meet the minister during the COVID-19, I remember, the first few months, and in her office. And I remember she was talking about, she was very much engaged in building 20,000 classrooms in about, I think she had about 3 to 6 months. So very impressed to hear that. And I was wondering if she was expecting Chinese, or I don't know, some of these construction companies. By the way, she was actually working with the army, working with the police, with the communities to build those schools. So that's quite impressive. Thank you, Minister, again. Let me just welcome you to make the opening remark. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Albert. Honorable ministers, honorable deputy ministers, my colleague, Honorable Minister of State, Honorable Cabinet Secretary and delegates, distinguished speakers, exhibitors, ladies and gentlemen, good morning once again. I want to correct a bit. I didn't construct schools. It was done by the community, by the government. But I gained some knowledge in construction during that period. So I'm a half-baked engineer now in construction. So thank you so much. I would like to express my gratitude to eLearning Africa and partners for their dedication to annually prepare the eLearning Africa Conference, which is taking place in African countries on a rotation basis. And now it is our turn here in Rwanda. I'm delighted that the theme for this 15th International Conference and Exhibition on ICT for Education, Training, and skills development is a new purpose for education. I recognize it is essential that we increase our efforts in this regards given the turbulence caused by COVID-19. The pandemic has had tremendous socioeconomic consequences in all countries of the world. While remote learning solutions were easier to implement in developed countries, with the necessary infrastructure in place, school closures and continuous learning have posed a much bigger challenge in African countries. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Rwanda has placed great importance on improving the access and quality of its education. This is formulated in our country's Vision 2050, as well as in associated implementation plans such as the National Strategy for Transformation, NST1, and the Education Sector Strategic Plan, ESSP. Rwanda's overarching goal for the social transformation pillar of the National Strategy for Transformation, that is for 7 years from 2017 to 2024, is to develop Rwandans into a capable and skilled people with quality standards of living and a stable and secure society by ensuring quality of education for all, aiming at building a knowledge-based economy. Education is a key sector for this social and economic transformation. We need to focus on equipping our young people with the digital skills they need to enable them to be prepared for the socio-economic development of our country based on technology. This will not only include the need for a strong emphasis on digital literacy in our education systems with a focus on collaborative learning and problem solving, but also for young people to be flexible and adaptable. It requires the transfer of soft skills such as critical thinking, problem solving, and creativity. Furthermore, Rwanda has chosen to place ICT at the core of our education delivery chain because we believe in its power to improve teaching and learning and contribute to the quality of education we want. I'm delighted, therefore, to see the hosts of topics included in this conference's agenda, coupled with the multitude of skilled, experienced people in the area of e-learning and digital transformation who have been able to attend this important meeting. I know this can only have a profound effect on the development of our education systems, not only in the wake of the impact caused by COVID-19, but also given the new challenges which are being brought about as a result of our increasingly digital economies and the fourth industrial revolution. The comprehensive nature of this e-learning conference is illustrated by the many parallel sessions being held both today and tomorrow, ranging from topics such as digital development of soft skills in our schools, public and private sector partnership on education technology in schools, lessons learned from a rapid conversion of courses to a fully online format, strengthening capacities at African universities for quality and equitable higher education learning, boosting teachers' digital literacy, challenges of teaching online during COVID-19 pandemic. I have only picked 6 examples from the very many sessions taking place during this meeting. I believe numbering around 60 in all, but I have seen that they are very relevant and essential to support our education systems and communities as we embrace the challenges faced to meet our shared goals. Ladies and gentlemen, the conference will surely be an opportunity to promote the use of ICT for improving access to relevant information, education, and training in Africa, but also to support sustainable education solutions in order to drive economic and social prosperity of our respective countries. Recognizing education as a critical investment for future growth and development in our respective countries, let us leverage from eLearning Africa Conference to pave the way to the establishment and strengthening of collaboration within EdTech ecosystem as we strive towards more resilient education systems. I'm certain that you will all benefit immensely from this conference, and you will enjoy your time in Rwanda, a country of 1,000 hills, but also 1,000 smiles. I'm therefore pleased to officially open this conference and wish all of you a fruitful meeting. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Honorable Minister Valentine, for the opening speech. Now it's time for break. We have about 15 minutes delay, but I think we can adjust accordingly. So I'm going to encourage participants to visit the stands, the exhibitions areas. I'm sure they are very good opportunities and engagement with the different exhibitors. Thank you again for attending the opening. Thank you.